So keep in mind, when the fort was opened or began construction in 1819, the soldiers who garrisoned it were predominantly from the 5th United States Infantry, which is a regiment out of New England. So you might be curious as to what compelled these soldiers to want to enlist. A lot of it actually had to do with economics. Soldiers, this period, just before the early 18-teens, there was actually an economic depression in New England, so a lot of very trades-oriented people, journeymen, actually could not find jobs and work to support themselves, so a lot of them just enlisted in the military as a way to guarantee themselves at least had some kind of income, some kind of food, and some kind of housing. So that's how a lot of the soldiers ended up becoming in the military. So besides being soldiers, they also had a lot of other duties. When they arrived here in 1820, in the early 1820s, there was no labor force waiting for them. The fort was not built, so they had to construct the fort, and that was one of the reasons why the fort was considered so well built. Was there was a lot of journeymen and a lot of carpenters and a lot of blacksmiths and a lot of stonemasons who were enlisted with the army to fulfill, to make sure that they could at least have their daily ration. So that's one of the reasons why the fort was so well constructed and almost overbuilt, was because they just had a lot of tradespeople here who frankly were told build a fort. The army designed it, and that's what we did. So besides that, who likes to stay warm in winter? Because we all know Minnesota winters are nice, mild, and it never gets cold here, right? 200 years ago, it was probably quite a bit worse. So they did. This is an era before central heating. So in order to stay warm during this period, soldiers had to use fireplaces as well. That's where you cooked your food. That's where you got your hot water. So if you wanted hot water, or you wanted to be warm, or you wanted hot food, you had to get firewood. So today you think, well, that couldn't have been difficult. There's trees everywhere. If you've gone 5 minutes in Minneapolis, there's tree-lined boulevards left and right. Well, that's a very recent thing. That's because of European settlement. 200 years ago, if you were to stand on the Round Tower, which is still close to renovation, unfortunately, and look west, you would see a sea of grass stretching almost unbroken to the Great Rocky Mountains. This was all prairie. European settlement interrupted the fire cycle, which allowed for the forest to expand around what is today Minneapolis. If you wanted to gather firewood in the quantities you needed to keep this place nice and warm, you had to go all the way to Anoka. So that's about 30 miles by the crow flies, a bit longer on foot, so soldiers would have to march all the way from here at Fort Snelling up to Anoka, where they had a little encampment. They'd spend a few weeks gathering firewood and bring all the wood back here. To give you an idea how much firewood they'd go through in 1 year, take the parade ground, they would store it inside the fort here, but take the parade ground, which is behind me, and cover it in about 7 feet of wood. And that's 1 year. And that's with rationing. And the army did have years where they were short on firewood because they were cutting low quality wood or just didn't cut enough. So there's cold soldiers. That being said, keep in mind it takes a year to season firewood. So if you want your firewood, the firewood you're burning this winter to cook and clean and heat was the firewood you cut last winter. So they were doing this even in the middle of the blizzards, even in the middle of inclement weather. They would be marching, gathering firewood because they knew they wanted to be warm next winter. The last thing they also had to do was food. Who likes food? Most of us generally like a niblet every now and then. That being said, the army knew that this was the end of the supply chain. This was as far west as the army went during this period of the 1820s. In order to get supplies, the nearest city where they could place large contracts was St. Louis, Missouri, which was just a bit over a month away by boat. Keep in mind, this is an era before planes, trains, and automobiles, and really even good roads. So to get here, the only way was by boat, up the Mississippi. And when you think of it, the Mississippi, most people think, oh, it's a very placid river, there's not much going on, it's pretty calm and flat. That's because the Army Corps of Engineers has spent the last 200 years taming it. 200 years ago, the river had rapids, it had snags, it was a lot faster flowing because there was no check dams on it. So it was a bit more of a harrowing journey, and this is the year before even steamboats. So to get here, they would use they'd row the boats if it was too deep, they use sails if they could, and other times they would pole the barge. So they'd literally just have guys with poles pushing against the river bottom, against the current, and centipeding their way up the river. It could take up to a month to get here. So the army quickly figured out that every pound of food you grow is a pound of food we don't ship. So soldiers also had to maintain several hundred acres of land outside the fort as gardens to supplement their rations, and they also maintained fields as well. The gardens were there because the food here was pretty boring. It was usually your pound of bread, your half pound of salted meat, and then usually some form of dried peas or beans. To our modern sensibilities, we think, why would they do that? That doesn't seem right. Why would you just walk towards someone shooting at you? A lot of that had to do with the technology of the period. The U.S. Army of the period used this. This is a smoothbore flintlock musket, particularly This is a Harper's Ferry model of 1816. 1816 being the year they started manufacturing them, Harper's Ferry being the arsenal they started making them in one state, West Virginia. So, what all this means, smoothbore flintlock, this is a flintlock. There is a piece of flint held in the jaw. When I pull the trigger, that flies forward and hits this piece of steel, which creates a shower of sparks onto a pan of powder. That pan explodes, and a small amount of that explosion goes through a touch hole, touches off the main charge, and propels the bullet out the barrel. So what does smoothbore mean? Smoothbore means there's no rifling. It's just a tube. Rifling is a series of grooves in the barrel that make the bullet spin. However, this does not have that. The reason is that slows down your ability to load. A soldier armed with a rifle could shoot maybe 1 round a minute. The reason is to get the rifling to engage or make the bullet spin, you have to have the bullet be the same size as the barrel. So you basically have to hammer the bullet all the way down to the breech, which takes time. And these muskets are notoriously filthy. The more you shoot, the harder it is to reload. So a soldier who armed with a rifle who could maybe get a shot off a minute, pretty quick in combat, he's shooting once every minute and a half, every 2 minutes. So a soldier armed with a musket could fire as fast as 3 rounds per minute. So the Army chose rapid fire generalists over specialists. The infantry here also manned the artillery. The Army did maintain specific regiments of artillery. However, they were left on the East Coast to man the coastal fortifications in case the Europeans decided they wanted to come for a visit. The armed variety. So, that being said, that also led to the tactics of line infantry. These were not accurate. They could maybe hit a soldier or the target you were aiming at maybe at 50 yards. Beyond that, you kind of got lucky. They kind of just had the balls had a knuckle tendency where they would just kind of go straight and then they just started going in their own direction. So that's why you fire volley. The idea was by leveling or having a company or a battalion fire as one, it would create a wall of lead that would fly towards the target. The other thing is cavalry. Cavalry are just soldiers on horseback. Soldiers who are dispersed in more modern tactics could not fire fast enough to disperse a cavalry charge. If you had cavalry charging at you, these weapons would not allow you to drown the cavalry in bullets like modern weapons could. So the cavalry would reach you, and at that point, you would probably have to use this. So this is the bayonet. Just turns this into a basically giant spear. Horses, however, are in some cases smarter than humans and have a very strong self-preservationist instinct. So humans standing shoulder to shoulder close to the ranks, seeing cavalry, they can level their bayonets like so. And horses will see this and say, that's going to hurt, I'm going to go somewhere else. So you have your front rank standing like this, chest height, the second rank behind them, like so. And the idea is that well-disciplined infantry will stay close together, so cavalry will not run them down. There was such a thing as light infantry tactics, which we think of as more modern tactics, disperse, taking cover, shooting at will. But the reason why the Army taught that but didn't use it for most of its soldiers was cavalry would just run right over you, and formed infantry could advance right over you as well. So that's the reason why they did that. That's the reason why they would use these sort of linear tactics. To load one of these, it's a 12-step procedure. If you ever heard the term learn by the numbers, the idea was each motion would have a plate, and it would show you how you're supposed to be standing and what you're supposed to do. The sergeant would teach you the minutiae, the details, and then to do the drill, they would just yell numbers at you. So 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 12, and you were expected to be able to do those 12 steps and fire it in 22 seconds or less. So, the idea behind the drill the drill of motions was so that in the intense emotional moment that combat is, you can still perform these duties, even though you were probably thinking of your own self-preservation at that point. So to load one of these, you go up here, go through the steps, you bring the musket down, you flip open the pan, you reach back here and pull out a cartridge. Cartridges of the period were wrapped paper. Keep in mind there is no bullet in here today. There would be, it would be a bucket ball bullets at the time, so it was one large 65 caliber bullet fired out of a 69 caliber muzzle, which is of course bigger, so it's fast loading, and then 3 buckshot on top. You reach up here, break it with your teeth, pour a small amount of the powder, pour the rest of it down the barrel and seat everything. You then withdraw your ramrod and ram everything down to the breech of the musket. You have to return your ramrod because if you don't, you're left with a very, very fancy club because you can't reload. And then, once everything is done, you can then fire. Keep in mind, as I said earlier, these were not accurate. The Army did specify aim, so you were supposed to pick a target and aim at it. If you didn't hit it, try again. So, at this point, I will load and fire this musket. I will warn you before I actually shoot the musket, so you can cover your ears if you choose to do so. That was pretty loud, wasn't it? So, that was just one musket going off. Keep in mind, volleys could be hundreds of muskets going off as one. As I said, they would create this wall of lead. The idea was very similar to modern shock and awe tactics. A well-executed volley would slam into the opposing force, but the idea was he's marching and suddenly there would be 5 guys who weren't there anymore. The idea was to slowly wear down their morale. Keep in mind, very few times would soldiers actually get to points with their bayonets. Oftentimes they would just fire balls at each other until one side seemed like they were wavering. The side that was not wavering or had the better morale and the better spirit would then advance and push them off the field and disperse them. They might rally, they might just keep running, who knows. Very few instances of bayonets were actually used against other soldiers armed with bayonets. The other thing is, keep in mind, these were very large bullets. They were also made of soft lead. They have this lovely tendency when they hit a human body, they turn into very puck-shaped devices that when they hit bones, they tend to shatter the bone they hit, unlike modern bullets that tend to just snap them. If you were hit in the torso, there's very little a surgeon could do. However, if there was hit in the arm, really the only thing they could do is amputate. They did try. There was instances of people who were shot, who they did cast their arms, or for some fluke they were able to survive without an amputation, but in the expediency where there's large casualty events, where a surgeon can't spend that much time on each soldier, the fastest way they can fix the problem is to remove the problem. So, keep that in mind. That being said, if you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask them. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day here at Fort Snelling.
That's what I was thinking. Red cloud. No, it's not.